Kia ora and welcome to this screencast about Level 3 NCEA Achievement Standard AS91608. This standard is titled Undertake Brief Development to Address an Issue with a Determined Context, and it is at Level 8 of the New Zealand curriculum. There are a number of supporting documents that can help to unpack the requirements of this standard. The two main documents are the standard itself and the Teaching and Learning Guide. One of the quickest and easiest ways to access both of these is to use the hyperlinked matrix in the resource section of the Mint Education website. As a quick reminder, the generic standards running across the page tend to focus on process, whereas the columns down the page, such as construction and mechanical technologies, tend to be more outcome focused. Additional supporting documents can be found on the Technology subject page on the NZQA website. Here you will be able to find clarifications, exemplars and the National Moderators Report, as well as links to the standard and the Teaching and Learning Guide. This slide is a reminder of the relationship between context, issue and need. A context is an overarching theme or general topic, and these are shown around the edges of the slide. It is the focus of technological development or the learning experience itself. In the diagram, it's represented also by the blue circle. An issue sits within the context and is a subset of it. In the diagram, this is represented by the red circles. A need arises from the issue and is the identified requirement of a person or a group of people or an environment. And in the diagram, this is shown by the green circles. So for example, a context could be fundraising for charity. An issue could be to make something to sell at school for market day. And a need could be the gift item or the product to be produced. You could also look at the UN sustainability goals for ideas and inspiration of more contexts. At Level 3, the clarifications are a reminder that the student has to establish an issue as well as identify, explore and explain related context considerations. There are some literacy considerations associated with this, and students and teachers should refer to the explanatory notes in the standard and the definitions in the technology glossary on TKI to ensure they understand what is meant by the terminology. A second point is that students need to identify stakeholders and involve them in the process of developing the outcome, as well as potentially the outcome itself. The number of stakeholders is not explicitly stated, but the use of the plural terms key stakeholders and wider stakeholders in explanatory note 2 of the standard implies that there should be at least 2 of each. And finally, the step up at Level 3 is the consideration of what fitness for purpose in the broadest sense entails. The categories of criteria listed in an explanatory note 5 in the standard make it clear that these relate to the outcome itself as well as to the practices used to develop the outcome. Fitness for purpose in the broadest sense means that students need to show they considered the issue of choice, to make this thing or that thing, and that they looked at multiple considerations and applied some screening criteria to make decisions. This slide is an indication of the step up from Level 1 or 2 to considerations of fitness for purpose in the broadest sense at Level 3. At Level 1 or 2, students are concerned with the who, what, where, when, how and why questions, whereas at Level 3, students need to delve more deeply. As part of the evidence for fitness for purpose in the broadest sense, students would want to show that they had considered alternative choices and that they had used a more comprehensive set of criteria in consideration both of the process of manufacture and of the outcome itself. This information about the awarding of grades is taken from the National Moderators Report. A student can be said to have holistically achieved if they have considered all areas for fitness for purpose, but some of them have been done more superficially than others. In order to award a grade of merit or excellence, everything needs to have been done fully at that level and all criteria have to be fully addressed. In this screencast, we're going to concentrate on what kind of evidence should be collected and how this evidence may be captured. And we're particularly going to focus on the limitations which are due to the lockdown of COVID-19. Two tools that are particularly useful are Google Translate and Word. Both of these have the capacity to use a microphone to record input as a verbal input rather than typing on a keyboard. So to use either of these, you simply select the microphone icon and talk to your microphone on the computer. The program will detect the speech and change it into text. What you can then do is cut and paste the text and put it into a document. This is useful for people who find it easy to articulate things verbally, and you may find it helpful for students who suffer from dyspraxia or dyslexia. It's also useful for students for whom English is not the first language, as sometimes they find it easier to speak things than to write things. A further feature of the Google Translate is that you can also cut and paste written text into the program and use the speaker icon to have it read it back to you. This is really useful if you're writing an external report, because quite often it's easier to hear where you've made a mistake rather than spot it when it's written down. Further guidance for remote learning and assessment can be found on the technology homepage, and you will see here that NZQA advise that supporting evidence can be a multiple of forms, including video, photos, annotations, written portfolios and e-portfolios. On the NZQA technology subject homepage, you'll also be able to find this adapted matrix. This shows that level 3 AS91608 is rated as green and means that it is entirely suitable for remote teaching, learning and assessment. One further useful resource that has been developed by NZQA is this evidence gathering template. And this is also available from the technology subject homepage at NZQA. So how do we start with context and issues? Students are going to be most successfully engaged when everything is real and relevant for them. Through the consideration of the context leading to the identification of an issue within the context, the student will be able to focus on the need or opportunity of the issue. And this leads to a more focused, researched approach. The student investigates the social and physical environment of the context to inform the writing of the design brief, to establish fitness for purpose in the broadest sense of the identified need or opportunity within the issue. Some examples of context have been given in the Achievement Standard, but students can be free to choose a different one. In this screencast, I'm going to use the example of living in lockdown as a context in order to show how issues and needs might be identified. I'm not suggesting that this would be appropriate for use with students at this time, as it may be too traumatic for them. A brainstorm is a useful way of capturing a lot of ideas and information in one go. So with my context of living in lockdown, I've looked at the issue of social distancing and physical distancing. And what I'm showing here is a collection of images which show other people's responses to problems arising as a result of that issue. So the questions that also have to be applied to these possible solutions are not only are they technically feasible, but are they sociably acceptable, and to whom? The role of the teacher in all of this is to provide some big picture thinking and answer the question of whether there's going to be enough in the issue or need that the student has identified to cover all the requirements of the brief. A further question to ask is, what is the student going to be able to cope with? So here are a couple of examples from real life as to how businesses have responded to an issue and created an opportunity from that. So in this example, the designer Reese Cooper had a lot of fabric that was supposed to be made into jackets, and the whole order was cancelled. So what they decided to do was to produce a DIY set of instructions for people to order the fabric, the notions, the pattern, the instructions, everything online, to be able to do it themselves in lockdown. Kiwi Business the Cookie Project, which generates work for disabled bakers, found that during lockdown they couldn't bake biscuits anymore, which is their main business. So they pivoted to create a bake your own cookie starter kit which people could order online. So this is an example of a group of people seeing an opportunity, a need within an issue and producing something in response to that. Through the consideration of the context, the issue can be identified within the contexts, and so students can focus on the needs and the opportunities of the issue, which leads to more focused research. Students will investigate the social and physical environment of the context to inform what they are writing in their brief and establish fitness for purpose in the broadest sense. So context considerations also help to identify suitable stakeholders. So if we take the example of exercising at home, some context considerations are: where is this activity taking place, and what are the constraints or limiting factors, such as the available space? Is any special clothing needed? And if so, what are the special features and attributes required by that clothing? So we might then look at how is the need being met currently? What existing products are there already? And how well do they meet that need? So this is where carrying out a PMI plus minus an interesting evaluation helps to establish some criteria which may be useful later for judging fitness for purpose in the broadest sense. This also leads to the question, is there the opportunity to improve something which might help with the brief writing? We ask, why does this situation occur? What are the physical and social factors that bring it about? Are there alternatives to the solution that we can see at the moment? And if so, what barriers do the alternatives present? And finally, we can ask, who's the main stakeholder here? What are their needs and what are their expectations? So that relates back to existing products, and we can say, what are the market expectations or the expectations of the target group in relation to the identified need or opportunity? An examination of the standard has already told us that there should be at least 2 key stakeholders and at least 2 wider stakeholders. It's also important to make sure that they're accessible to the student, that they are available for iterative discussions or feedback, and that they can help justify decision making. A final consideration is that they can provide authentic voice. So as an example, here is an identified need for a cat, which is a diabetic cat and suffers from the cold and needs a jumper to help keep it warm. So we've got 2 alternative jumpers here. How is the cat going to provide us with authentic voice to let us know which one they prefer? And if we take some expert advice from wider stakeholders, such as the cat's owner or perhaps even some vets, it's still going to be very difficult to capture that authentic voice from the key stakeholder, which is in this instance the cat. A useful graphic organizer for clarifying stakeholder voice is to use a target diagram. So if we put the key stakeholder or stakeholders at the center of that diagram in the red area, that's the person for whom this product or thing that we might make is being developed and who is going to be most impacted by it. In the next circle, which is colored yellow, go the next set of people who are going to be impacted by that product. And finally, in the blue circle goes the wider social considerations. So typically in a student context, the student's designing for themselves, the student goes into the red circle. The next group of people who will impact on the student may be their peers, their classmates, or the teacher. And some or all of those are going to be in the red circle and be considered key stakeholders, or they might just be influencing stakeholders. And finally, In the blue circle will be the wider group of people that the student interacts with that proposed technological outcome. And that might be their extended family or their social groups or their social activities in which they interact. So it could be things like church groups, leisure time activities or sports groups. Now, the real advantage for doing this for stakeholder voice is that you can apply a weighting to the target diagram, just like you would on a dartboard or an archery target. So the people in the center have a higher point weighting than the people on the outer side. So for example, if we give the people in the center a weighting of 5 points, if one person in the center likes option A, that means they have a weighting of 1 times 5 points or 5 points. If the people in the outer circle have a weighting of 1 point, that means that each person in the outer circle has 1 times 1 point or 1 point. So if 4 people in the outer circle prefer option B, this means that you've got 4 times 1 point or 4 points, as opposed to the one person in the center who will still have 5 points. And that can provide a criteria for justification as to why option A should be developed and not option B, which on the surface of it, you would say more people showed a preference for. So this standard is concerned with brief development. What are the parts of the brief? Well, the first part is a conceptual statement, and this communicates what is to be done and why it should be done. In other words, the focus and purpose. And the statement must be based on findings from the exploration of the context or issue from which the need or opportunity has been identified. And this can be communicated by writing, by drawing, or with an oral presentation. And the second part of the brief are the specifications. So these lay down the various requirements that have to be met if the outcome is to be judged as fit for purpose. And so they relate to the outcome's physical and functional nature, what's wanted in terms of appearance, performance, and so on. And your specifications are going to provide criteria for ongoing evaluation through the development process, and against which the final outcome can be judged for fit for purpose or not, as the case might be. And these are what enable the product to be evaluated as fitness for purpose in its broadest sense. So as a precursor to this, it's important to identify the attributes so that you can help develop a specification. It's important to remember that this standard is about brief development. There's no expectation or requirement that the student should develop the outcome or the conceptual design, although they may go on and do that. So at this stage, the specification would be concerned with the design specification or a product specification and not a manufacturing specification. It may be helpful for students first to explore the attributes, which are general characteristics or aspects of the physical and functional nature of technological outcomes. So physical refers to how something looks, and functional refers to how something works. So as a general example, we could say that an attribute might be that something should be colourful, or easy to put on or take off, or it should be easy to hold in your hand. Specifications define the actual requirements of the physical and functional nature of the outcome in more detail and in a way that's measurable. So for example, rather than saying it must be colourful, we would say the colour must be blue. Rather than saying it should be easy to hold in your hand, we would say it should be no larger than 10 centimetres squared. So an example of this progression in textiles might be, we could say that a garment should be easy to put on or take off. A product specification might say it should have a 15 centimetre zip. And a manufacturing specification might say it should have a 15 centimetre zip, which will be an invisible zip sewn on a side seam with a certain colour of thread and a certain number of stitches per centimetre. In conclusion, the parts of a brief include a conceptual statement and specifications, and the specifications will be developed from the attributes which have been identified. Within the standard, explanatory note 5 defines what fitness for purpose in the broader sense includes, and there's a list of criteria that students need to consider. Now, it's intended that the students should identify those which are most relevant to the product outcome which they are intending to develop and focus on these. However, in order to exclude things, it will still be necessary to visit them and say why it is or isn't appropriate to focus on that thing and then leave it alone. It's also important to remember that fitness for purpose in this particular standard relates to the process of developing the outcome as well as to the outcome itself. This table shows the acronym ACCESS-FM, which is a useful way to develop specifications. So the aesthetic, A, means what's the intended look, what colours, what patterns are you going to use, what did your research tell you, and how and why have you made decisions on that. C is for consumer, the ergonomic considerations, the sector expectations, the range of movements that you might actually undertake, the special needs that there might be. The next C is for cost. What's the impact of the manufacturing process? Do you have to weigh up time versus cost, quality versus cost? E is for environment. So not just considering the physical environment in which the need or opportunity will occur, but also the environment in terms of the green and sustainable environment in terms of the manufacturing processes. S is for safety. So undertaking health and safety and risk assessment, not just for the product that is to be developed, but for the activities that are engaged in developing the product and in testing the product. S is for size. So do we need to consider a general size or a specific size? Does it need to be an adjustable size or not? And how does this research relate to anthropometrics and materials? F is for function. What is the main function or functions of the product to be developed? What does it do in some full detail? And finally, materials. So the general attributes of materials, flexible, moisture retaining, and so on. And might there have to be a compromise on quality or cost? At level 3, it's expected that students will have developed their own strategies for undertaking research and will not necessarily be following a sequential sequence of operations. This slide shows a checklist which is helpful to use with students to ensure that they have full coverage no matter where they start from. So one way you can use this is to ask students to pick a line, either horizontal or vertical, and cover all those aspects first. Or they can work around the table, or they can just dive straight in and tick one thing off at a time as they go along. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show you some examples of student work and how they've undertaken research to explore contexts, develop issues, and identify needs within that. So in this example, the student visited the Pop-Up Globe in Auckland on an English trip to watch a Shakespearean play. And so what they were looking at was the theatrical production of a historic play, but in a modern setting, but with authenticity with regard to the period. And they looked at this specific environment, the temporary nature of the theatre itself, the open air, and how it was exposed to various environmental factors. They also looked at the costuming of the actors on stage and the physicality of the performance and what was needed in terms of balancing authenticity of the costume in relation to the materials that were currently available. In further research, the student was able to examine some of the costumes close up, and they learned more of the detail of how they were made using authentic techniques, but of course they would be using more modern materials, including fastenings. They discovered some interesting factors, such as the costumes did not use zips and Velcro. They were authentically made by tying the points, which are strings with pointed ends to them, to the costumes. And they considered how this was difficult for actors in costume changes and made it harder to put things on and off and have rapid costume changes, and how this also affected the design of the costumes. They then looked at some historical examples of costumes and discovered what were things that would be no longer socially acceptable now, such as the use of fur, and how the materials of the authentic period were extremely costly and would not be appropriate or available to the student if they were going on to develop a costume for themselves. They also started to consider social acceptability. So in Shakespeare's time, the parts of women were played by men, and would this be acceptable in today's society, especially in light of the Me Too movement? They thought about the colours that were used and how they were quite muted and soft, and identified that that would be as a result of the use of natural dyes which would fade in light. And so if we go back to the table that I showed you earlier, those highlighted areas indicate where at this stage the student has begun to investigate those key factors. And so if the student's going to go on and develop their own issue, which is the need for a costume for the school play, a Shakespearean play, they have a body of research that they can now expand upon and some appropriate things that they can focus on for fitness for purpose. It's to be expected that different students will choose to undertake research in different and diverse ways, and that's only appropriate. So in this example, a student's looking at the issue of the cookie project and looking at the social issues around that and the possible context that there might be. So looking at things like recipe development, dietary issues, and actual food production. So thinking about this and writing a commentary helps them to establish needs that are arising out of a situation. And they're exploring current and future issues of food production. So the opportunity that they identified was that the business wanted to create new flavours of biscuit. And so one of the pieces of research that they carried out was to take a survey of people to ask what were their favourite biscuits. And this allowed them to include several different types of question and get several different responses, which they could then use to provide and make charts and graphs to show a summary of their results. They also carried out an exploration of different contexts, for example, looking at people who had special dietary needs and carrying out a plus minus and interesting evaluation of those contexts to decide which one was going to be most suitable for them to carry on and explore. And so if we look at that small chart again, we can see that this particular student has explored a different range of characteristics of fitness for purpose in the broadest possible sense, and is exploring different types of research. It's important that students have clarification on the terminology and language that is used in this standard. Terminology of the technological language can be found from the technology glossary on TKI. Demonstrating is that the student has evidence that shows how, and justifying is where the student provides an explanation with acceptable reasons or evidence. For merit, the student has to have evidence that links the specifications to stakeholder feedback and the nature of the outcome. And at excellence, students should be justifying the specifications based on stakeholder feedback and the nature of the outcome. As we've mentioned before, holistic achieved means there's some evidence that covers all of the criteria, but some is weaker than others. For a higher grade to be awarded, all the evidence must consistently be at that standard. So just a quick reminder again of the step-ups. At level 1, the context and issue are provided by the teacher. At level 2, the students identify an issue from a teacher-given context. And at level 3, explanatory notes states that students will establish an issue and explore related context considerations. So at level 3, it's an iterative process. to continually link the context, the issue, the need or opportunity, and the outcome being developed through the involvement of stakeholder consultation and feedback. The process is dialogic. It involves consultation, it involves consideration of a wide number of factors, and it involves developing some criteria for including or excluding some of those factors in order to evaluate potential things that you might do and make decisions based on that. Explanatory Note 6 explains that the brief development work for this standard can be for either a conceptual design and or the outcome itself, but there's no requirement that the outcome specified in the brief is actually produced. Students may choose to go on and develop the conceptual design and or the prototype later, but those are assessed against different standards. The supporting material for this screencast has some specific examples of context consideration for both food and textiles. So one of the key things to consider and remember is that we're talking about the processes used to develop the outcome, not just the outcome itself. And an example from real life of ethical nature of testing practices: my daughter was in a supermarket and they asked her to sample some biscuits that had been made from cricket flour. What my daughter didn't realise was that the cricket flour was not cricket flour that would be used when you make afternoon tea for the cricket match or the cricket team, but it was actually made from the insect crickets. And as a vegetarian, she found that absolutely repulsive. She actually had the food in her mouth and spat it out when she realised. So it really is important to make sure that there is full disclosure about what you're doing in relation to your testing practices. This issue of the determination of the life cycle, the maintenance and the ultimate disposal of the product requires the students to think deeply about the sustainability of the resources that they're using. It's not just about whether something is easy to wash or whether it can go to a charity shop when you've tired of wearing it. It's about, have you considered the lifespan of your intended outcome? And this applies to both food and to textiles. So an example from real life is that in the cafe Little and Friday, they use one brioche recipe in all of their products. And this means that if, for example, their brioche buns become stale after one day, as they do, they will then take that brioche and they will use that to make bread and butter pudding from the same brioche. So it's about looking at what is the intended lifespan of your product. What is its potential longevity? And with food, there is going to be health and hygiene issues associated with that. How is somebody going to use your product and for how long? And again, you can relate this back to your sector expectations. It also will relate to the quality of the product as well. And it's about building in longevity to your design and not building in obsolescence. And this all should be informed by your stakeholder feedback and the iterative discussions you will be having with stakeholders. All of which goes to prove a point that it's really important to include relevant stakeholders in your consultations and to make sure that you don't impose solutions on them, that you are genuinely designing to address that need or opportunity that you have identified, and that your solution is informed by the opinions of the intended end user. Thank you for listening to this screencast. My name is Pippa Lawler. I am the Kaiarahi for Subject Association HETANS in the area of technology. This is my email, mintednz@gmail.com, if you have any further questions in relation to this screencast. Ka kite.